Alright, so all the supplies I'm going to use for this is this pan of just watercolor paints, and I got these at Michael's for $4.99, and it's just the watercolor pan set by Artist Loft, and it comes with 36 colors, but we're not going to use all of them, and I'll show you which ones we will use. And then I bought a pack of artist sponges. These were also $4.99, so all of this was about $10. So for the sponges, you're just gonna take one and you're gonna wet it to soften it up, and you're just gonna be using one of the edges, so it doesn't really matter which sponge you use. For the colors, it comes with this brush. It's not the best brush in the world, but it'll do. The colors we're going to be using is this dark yellow over here, this sort of maroon, this purple, and then this green. And we might use the blue or the gray, but it depends on how the bruise starts to turn out. So what you're going to start with your sponge, and this is a glass of water. You're going to start with your sponge, and you're going to squeeze out. After you wet it, you're going to squeeze out most of the water until it's just damp. Then you're going to dab it on the color you want, and you want to start with the dark yellow. So once you get a good amount of paint on the sponge, you're going to start doing the shape you want for the bruise. So for the bruise, we're going to start dabbing the yellow in sort of a circle, oval. And I'm just dabbing, and I'm not like rubbing it out. So I'm gonna go with one about that size. And then I'm going to wet the sponge again and get most of the color out and most of the water out. And then I'm just gonna dab the edges to soften it up. All right, and then I'm gonna clean out the sponge so it doesn't have the leftover yellow. And then I'm gonna do the same thing I did with the yellow, but I'm gonna do it with this lime green over here. And I'm just gonna get some on the sponge and then start to dab it inside the yellow, but I don't wanna go outside. And it's gonna look really dark. So after you do 2 or 3 pats, turn the sponge so you have more of the dry side, and do that to pat it down and spread it. And then if you need more green, which this does, you can use the rest of what's on your sponge. And just make sure you spread it out. So that you end up with something like that, where the colors aren't super vibrant, but they're definitely there. And you just dab it to blend it in. And that'll give you that like sickly yellow instead of the bright yellow or the lime green. You're gonna clean your sponge again. And it's very helpful to know the different stages of bruising. This particular bruise is gonna end up being one after 2 or 3 days. Because it'll have the yellow and green that's healing, and it, like, as it goes in, it's getting closer and closer to the source of where the impact was. But after the green, you're gonna take this bright purple and get the color on your sponge. And you wanna be careful with the darker colors and make sure you don't get as much, so it's not like coating the sponge, but it's just barely there. Especially if you're doing a smaller bruise, because a lot of paint for this goes a long way. So you're just gonna dab that on top really lightly until you get something like that. And make sure it's inside, and you don't wanna go all the way to the edge, because the yellow and green should like be an edge around it. So then you're going to clean off your sponge again, and make sure there's no paint and that it's barely damp. And then you're going to very carefully start to dab that and blend it in. And the tricky part about the watercolors is that if you do accidentally use too much water, it makes the blending difficult and it will start to run. And if it starts to run when you dab it, it'll take the color off that you've already put down. So you want to make sure there's barely any water in the sponge. And then you'll end up with something about like that. And you don't want the colors to be completely solid. It's good that it has some areas that are a little bit darker and it looks like the texture of the sponge, because it looks like the parts under their skin are broken and still bleeding. And then you want to try to make sure it's at least fairly dry between each color layer that you do. And then after the purple, you're doing this dark maroon red color. And this is what really makes it look like a fresher bruise. So if you were going for a bruise that happened like the day of, you would just probably end up using this purple and this dark maroon color. And for the maroon color, you're gonna do the same thing you did with the purple and make sure that there's no extra covering it, because this ends up being really dark when you start to dab it on. And this is the color that you want to have the most splotchiness with, because it really gives it that quality that really makes it look lifelike. And after you get the base for that, you're going to go back with your clean, damp sponge and soften up the edges around where the darker colors meet the yellow and the green. And you're just doing that by dabbing. And the more you end up blending out the colors, the more it sort of fades into the skin and looks more lifelike. And the reason I'm using watercolors is because it gives it that translucence that makes it look like it's actually under the skin. So once you've got that, there's a cat on my shoulder. Once you've got that, you're gonna want to go back with the purple, and this is where you're gonna start making it darker. So you're gonna get more on your sponge. But you're just going to do 2 or 3 taps. That was 4, but usually 2 or 3. And then go back with that clean sponge and very carefully start to spread it out. And then pretty much the rest of the process is going back and forth with the purple and the dark red to get the right darkness for the bruise. But one thing that definitely helps is if you go in with this bright blue right here, but you don't want to use very much at all. And you just barely go around the edges of where the darker colors meet the green and the yellow. And then you clean off your sponge and you blend that inwards and make sure you don't blend it out. So when you dab, you don't want to do it on top of it, you want to do it more to the side so it goes in. The only thing about blending the darker colors is that you do end up with some back on the sponge, so you want to make sure that you're cleaning the sponge fairly regularly and making sure you're not dragging more paint on top of it. All right, and I think I'm gonna go back in with some more purple. Do that right in the middle. And get the clean sponge. And then after the purple, I think this is going to be the last layering before I start adding details. And you're going to get that darker maroon red. And try to make this one splotchy. So like that. Then you're gonna let that dry for a few seconds so you're not ruining the color when you start to spread it and make it more splotchy. All right, so we're gonna go in and just very, very lightly tap over that. To add more of the lifelike part to the bruise, what you're gonna do is you're gonna take, I'm just using the brush it came with because it's cheap and you can spread it out on your hand like that. And you get just a little bit of water and spread it out so it's just barely wet. You're gonna take it and dip it in your purple all spread out like that. And then just dot the inside red part. Then you're gonna dab that with the clean, damp sponge. If your model is really pale, one thing that helps to sort of darken it up is to get just, not very much at all, but the gray at the bottom, but only a light amount, and dab it over. So once you do that, you go back in with the clean damp sponge. And that just makes it more apparent. And it also gives it that veiny feel. So I think, and then at this point, it's really just kind of a game of eyeing it and trying to decide what you think will look best. I think for the middle, I want it to be a little more purple, so I'm going to add a little more. Just right there. And let that dry for a couple seconds. Let my sponge dry out, and then get back in. Sorry this edge over here isn't fantastic. I'm just having issues seeing it with the setup, but it's fine. So after you've got the purple, one of the things you want is you want the end effect to have the splotchy red. So you're gonna go back in with that and dab it. And I'm going to take the brush again and spread it out and sort of spread it around and make it uneven. And then it'll clean up better when you go back in with the sponge to blend it. Alright, you want to give it a few seconds to dry. And then if you start to notice that the layers are becoming more and more separated, what you'll do is you go back in and dab it, and you'll pull lightly outwards. Okay. This might seem a little contradictory to what I just did. I'm gonna take the brush and I'm gonna mix a little bit of the purple, a little bit of the dark red. I'm sort of gonna outline the middle of the bruise, which is more over here because it would just kind of worked out that way, and not all bruises are perfectly round and heal perfectly. So once you have that, you start doing this with the brush. And then go back in over it with the sponge. So I'm gonna take the sponge and I'm gonna do the purple, and I'm actually gonna mix it with the red again, but I'm gonna do it this time with the sponge. Alright, I'm actually gonna leave that for about 30 seconds to a minute to make sure it's completely dry. And while I'm doing that, I'll make sure the sponge doesn't have any of that extra color, because the darker colors tend to linger. And if you find that your sponge is getting too dirty to work with and your water's not cleaning it up like it should, you can switch sponges, which can be good because each of these artist sponges are different shapes and they all have different textures. So like this surface is actually pretty smooth, although it does have the textured surface, but this is a lot more broken up. So I think I'm gonna use this and wet it just a little bit. Make sure it's nice and squeezed out before I start to dab over it. And for most of what you're doing at this point is you're not concentrating too much on the middle part. You're just trying to make sure those edges blend. And of course, the nice thing about makeup is if you mess up, you can always wipe it off and start again. So once you get to that point, let it dry. And then at this point, you're going to very carefully use this peach skin color. It depends on the skin tone of your model. You might use anything from the peach to this more tan to the darker brown. And if you can't get the exact color, you can mix up your own. So I'm gonna use a bit of the peach. I'm gonna spread it around the sponge with my finger to make sure it's really light. And then I'm just really lightly gonna dab over. And then that's it. When you are finished and after your model is done, it comes off really easily. All you have to do is get one of your sponges, you might want to make sure it's clean, and just wet it, and then swipe it across. And then you can use a paper towel to get off the rest. And you might need to swipe it a few times. And some of the color will try to stay, but it definitely comes out after a shower, and the parts that don't come out always are never that dark.